And we'll hope to cover two main areas. We're so lucky to have Bob, who is clearly, and probably wants to argue with me, well, maybe he doesn't, the leader of the modern environmental movement. He was there before anybody else, and now joined by Billy. And Billy, with her incredible environmental art, which touches so much on what Brushwood is about in terms of the intersection of nature and art. So we want to get to both of those key areas tonight. So let me ask the first question, and really you both can answer in any way that you want, and you can argue with each other too, because Bill and I do.
Argue. Is this on? Is this
Yeah,
okay?
every.
Okay.
I don't think
Do we have Bob's mic? I'm going to try again.
is this on? I don't think it's.
Yeah, it does. They got it now.
And you can hear me too?
But I think Billy arranged for your mic not to be on, Bob. Given that you have both.
Otherwise, you can have mine.
I think that one's working now. Given that you both devoted so much of your lives now in this new direction, why do you believe that art is such an important and effective tool for environmental protection? It's a good move.
Well, first of all, I want to thank everybody for having joined us to view this amazing ceremony. And if I may say so, but you know, this is a really beautiful collaboration with, you know, all the artists that are so dedicated to this earth and who are so believing in, you know, trying through art and their amazing talents to preserve this beautiful planet, but also to open up consciousness, you know, how endangered this beautiful planet is. So I want to thank all of you, and I'm very proud of every single artist who has joined our mission and our message. So thank you for that. But I think, yes, thank you. For me, I think art is my only language, you know, to create art, I'm not a really great speaker, I'm not a writer. Since my early childhood, art has been my only tool to express my emotions. And so I believe in that. It has guided me throughout my life. It has given me comfort. It has answered questions that could not be answered in any other way. So art, for me, it's my soul friend. It's my, you know, it's my guidance. It's nature and art, always has been. So that's all I can say to that.
For me, I think, is this on? Yep. Yeah. For me, art really does two things. It can describe and critique society. I think those are two those are two strong attributes. I can explain a little bit later. I don't want to take up your time now about, excuse me, how art came into my life. And in a way, at the time it did come into my life, it saved my life. We can get into that at a different time.
That's for the after party.
Well, I'll make it very brief. When I was a kid growing up in Los Angeles, it was during the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, and as a child, I did not pay much attention to teachers who were talking because, to me, it was boring, and I didn't understand that the teachers at that time were substitute teachers because the real teachers were off in the war. So for me, it was just a lot of boring noise that went past my ear, and it did not capture my attention. So what I did was I indulged in something that I really loved doing, which was drawing. So I would draw, and I would draw all kinds of things. And that kept me occupied, but I would do it under the table because I didn't want to be caught because I was supposed to be listening to the lecture. And I was just drawing away and drawing away. The third grade teacher said, excuse me, you over there, Redford, what's so important underneath the table? that's more important than what we're talking about. And I thought, oh, God, I'm going to be burned now. I'm just going to be burned alive with all my classmates are just going to love this, to see me get burned. So she said, why don't you come up? Class was laughing. And so she said, why don't you just come up here and show us what's more important than what we're talking about? So I went up and I held up this drawing that I had made, and she said, why don't you tell us about it? And I said, okay, well, because this was the Second World War. So I said, well, here are a bunch of cowboys chasing Indians over a cliff. And the Indians, as they're going over a cliff, are throwing arrows back at the cowboys, as the cowboys are shooting at the Indians. And above the cowboys are B-51 bombers bombing the cowboys. So the class really got onto that. The class thought that was pretty cool. So anyway, they liked it. And then she saw that, and she realized that that was something that I did that was not considered de rigueur in those days. So she said, I tell you what, if you promise to pay attention to the class, what's going on, we'll give you an easel with some newsprint paper, and we'll give you 10 minutes every Wednesday and have you come up and draw a story. So at that moment, at a time when I could have been totally trashed, and God knows what would have happened to my sensibility or my ego, she gave me a chance. And if that moment hadn't happened, I don't know where I would be, because I realized that art was important and that I could make it important in my life.
Let me get back to Billy. Before we let this go, Billy, tonight we saw a wonderful piece of art and nature. Bob has done a lot of documentaries on the environment. I've done a lot of, but we were mainstream. We were movies, television primarily, and sometimes I would walk away and say, well, either nobody watched or they didn't remember anything that I said. But you did something different tonight. You took your art and you, with collaboration of those around you, the Indians, the sound, the dancers, and you came up with something that reached through, both with facts but primarily emotion on the problems today. What makes that important and effective?
Well, let me tell you, I have been an environmental artist for maybe over 30 years, and the beginning of that journey has been a very solitary journey. So, you know, I created a lot of art in my studio. I started actually as a child because I grew up on a farm. The first 6 years of my life, I grew up in post-war Germany, and the cities were all destroyed, so there was only space to live, really, in the countryside, and that was my luck. I loved it. We would sleep in the hay barn in the summers. I could run around barefoot all day long, and there was all this freedom, and I was surrounded by animals and trees and fruit, vegetables. We had everything grown in our garden. But what happened was, you know, the cities, after I turned about 6 years old, the cities were rebuilt, and it was an aim for every parents to move into the city to make better in life. So I ended up in the city, and I was totally lost. And so this is when I created actually my first nature paintings, just to plaster them around my room to bring nature back into my life. And that was my savior, you know. So I have been very emotionally attached to nature, and when it was taken away from me at that time, when I was a youth, it was really dramatic for me. And I realized throughout my, future life, this is just a pattern that humanity creates. They just, shrink nature and like development. And so throughout me growing up and even during my working life, I always tried to figure out ways through my art to create a voice, to point out, we cannot move along this path because we will destroy in the end ourselves. But what happened was it was a struggle. As a single artist, I was a single voice, and I decided I have to find a way to create a bigger, stronger voice. And I decided to pull in art forms, different art forms I was very passionate about, and that is music, of course. You know, I would always paint with music, dance, modern dance, you know, light, film, spoken word, you know, pretty much everything that touches your heart and soul. And I thought, if I can bring that together and we can create a statement that points out, you know, how endangered our planet is, hopefully, you know, we find some more attention. And the more emotional we can be, and the more we can touch people's hearts and soul to make them understand this is the only planet we have that we can live on, maybe there's a way to make them understand, because I believe we all know how endangered this one and only planet is, and we see and hear statistics, numbers, and we know, you know, we have to make changes, but we are not making them. So I think we all have a heart and a soul, and if we can be touched emotionally, maybe that will, you know, break us somehow, that we turn around. And I feel very strongly, you know, the reason I feel very strong about American Indians in our show, this is, first of all, we are on their land, on this continent. It has been taken away from them in a very brutal way, which has happened not only here, but all over the world. And I feel it's time for us, with all the advancement we have with technology and, you know, our living standard, I feel we have to turn backwards. And I feel we have to turn back to the indigenous people that still exist on this planet in order to learn from them. Because if once we lose them, we have no time left.
Well said. I believe that too.
Bob, if you can share that microphone again. You have a quote that I saw that I loved. You said, some people have analysis, I have Utah. Now,
I should have been an analysis.
I'd say there's some meaningful research that backs you up on that point, and it points to the fact that critical health benefits of experiencing nature, and it's really a big part of what Brushwood Center does, as I think you know. Could you share some personal experiences of the healing power of spending time in nature for you?
Yes, when I was 11 years old, I had a mild case of polio. And it was not enough to put me in an iron lung, because that was before the Salk had the vaccine. So in those days, if you had polio, you went into an iron lung, and it was pretty traumatic. So I had a mild case of polio because I was very athletic. I didn't take care of myself, being too much in the water, too much in the sun. So I had this mild case, and I was bedridden for several weeks. And so I worked my way out of it very slowly, but I did. And I lost a lot of weight. And so my mom decided that she wanted to give me some kind of a reward for having gone through that. So I'd never been out of Los Angeles at that point in my life, and my mom decided, well, we'll take a trip to Yosemite National Park. So we did, and so I'll never forget coming out of Fresno and going through this long tunnel, a mile-long tunnel, dark, dark tunnel, and when you got out to the other side, it opened up into Inspiration Point, and there was Yosemite. There was El Capitan. There was Half Dome. There was all these phenomenal sculptured geology, and I just couldn't believe it. And I just remember saying, I don't want to look at this. I want to be in it. So from that point on, I decided I'm going to make sure that my life comes to this place. So I got a job there, two summers in a row, and I hiked all through Yosemite. And then I thought, well, how can I pay back how much that meant to me, and I decided once I got into film that I would try to use film and documentaries in particular to make points that I thought were forgotten points. So I made a documentary on Yosemite called Yosemite Fate of Heaven. That was in 1990. So that's when I decided, okay, in my life as it goes forward, I'm going to be more and more committed to nature because I can see nature being shrunk by development and by short-sighted thinking, by people that are thinking about making money right now. So the only thing I can do is to make clear what nature looked like when it was not disturbed. And that would be the best I could do to make a contribution to preserve nature.
Very good. I'm going to pick up on the word Yosemite, but I'll address this to you, Billy, one more time. I had the honor and pleasure of interviewing Ansel Adams at his studio in Yosemite. Can you imagine? He said the worst sound in the world is the sound of a Hasselblad bouncing down one of those cliffs. But I asked him, what is art? And he said, well, art is when the outside meets the inside to produce a product. I deal on the outside, news and documentaries. You deal on the inside. We've come to the point when those two forces must collaborate. That's what I saw in your work tonight. Is that what you're trying to do?
I haven't thought about it, but it's a really wonderful thought. Thank you for that. I think I'm very much an instinctive artist. Instinctive, is that the right word? I follow my instinct. I very much, throughout my life, follow my inner word, and I think this all happened very naturally because just the way I grew up and the way I tried to protect my environment, which was taken away from me, and throughout my life I realized, cities are wonderful and exciting and they provide a lot, but that for me, nature is my food. It's my food for my heart and my soul and for my whole being. And so, since art has been really my only language that I knew how to express my sorrows, but also my happiness, of course, I felt that is my tool I have to use to express how I feel about nature and this amazing earth. And I was so lucky up to now that on this path that I met people like Tim Janis, this amazing composer, who created this incredible music. My collaborator, Thomas McBee, who is just this unbelievable filmmaker. Thomas, I don't know where you are, but... and just, Robert Mirabal and his beautiful daughters, and... Evan, the eagle dancer, the hoop dance, these people are so amazing and they're so connected to what I'm trying to say. And I think, just to meet this group of people, to find that you speak the same language and you have the same passion. Like Lynn, our Mother Earth today, who is just so full of love and passion for this earth. Mairead, our violinist, who just honored Earth, everything about it. This passion, if we can bring this passion together and create a bigger and bigger and bigger voice, and this is my hope with the Way of the Rain, to find a bigger and bigger audience, to join all of us who are trying to find better ways to keep this beautiful Earth alive, and there for us. So it's all for us too,
Well, I guess I'm going to switch focus a little bit and try to get into this assessment of where we really are with the challenges that we all see, maybe from a political perspective. And fond of quoting you here tonight, I'm going to quote you again. You say, "I'm not a left-wing person. I'm just a person interested in the sustainability of my country." But somehow this has become a statement that has become a political statement, a negative political statement, oddly enough. And how do we get to the point where a thought like that becomes so marginalized? We just saw in the film when you were able to meet with the Russians and talk about global warming before anyone else really was. We're aware of the Clean Air Act under Nixon, so many successes that you had that just aren't there now because we're so polarized. Is there a way to change that? And if there is there a leading issue that would make sense as a wedge issue?
Well, I think, I believe optimism is better than pessimism. So I like to look at this optimistically. And I think that the future is probably going to belong to young people. And I think it's their turn. And I also think, although you can see it sort of happening, there seems to be a shift that's occurring. And the shift is moving us in a different direction that is honoring women more and young people. And I think that's very healthy and that's very good. So I think let that go. I mean, let that wind blow the way it's going to blow. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, you always have to be careful about indulgence and the polarization that can come when ideology sets in. And right now, what's sad for me is to see how polarized, unnecessarily polarized, this country is by this side and this side not knowing what the value of listening is. All you have to do is say, hey, you can have your ideas, I've got my ideas, they conflict, but can we just listen to each other? And who knows, maybe something will happen. But that doesn't, and sometimes that doesn't work because Billy never listens to me at all.
We have the same problem, I know what you mean.
But anyway, what I wanted to say about nature, why I think nature is so important, is that as technology has driven us further and further more towards special effects and things of that sort, and I think a lot of it is fabulous. But if you go too far and people get obsessed with the technology, they might miss what's natural. So I noticed when we have our Sundance Institute program that starts every summer at our lab program, I noticed that a lot of the lab participants that were coming out of New York or LA or San Francisco were totally focused on their phones. And I said, hey, you know, I tell you what, why don't you put the phones down? I mean, they're not going to go away. They're still going to be there. Why don't you put the phones down and just take a pause and take a walk outside and walk along the river? And you don't have to do anything. Just, if you want, think out loud, you know, but whatever you want to do, fine. But just take a walk and get away from the technology you're being obsessed with, and then see if that has any effect. And it did have an effect because they realized that they were missing something so valuable and so ancient, which is nature, and the role that nature plays in our lives. And they were losing sight of that in favor of the newest thing that was not going to have much life at all. Yeah.
Before we have to go, let me insert a few facts, or at least one. When we met about 10 years ago, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 300, 310, 320. And there was a prediction out of Ohio State that if it reached 400 parts per million, the Earth might restructure itself with less oxygen, more nitrogen. And I said, you know, I like breathing oxygen. But at what point, but nobody seems to listen even today, and they're waiting for 500 or 600 and saying, well, we can just blow through that and maybe live with carbon dioxide. What is going to take it for, not hurricanes, three worst, you know, in our history, to really make a dent? I think that you have said that local leaders, maybe organizations like Brushwood, should pick up the ball and really can make the difference.
That's one of the reasons I think so highly of Brushwood. I think it has that potential, and I think we need more Brushwoods. Or if Brushwood can take itself, expand itself, that would be great, because I think that's what we need. There needs to be, in my opinion, a new dialogue, a new kind of awareness that sets people off on a different path. And the other thing I wanted to mention before we're done here is the value of two sides working together. And I'm involved right now, a little self-promotion here, I'm involved in a documentary called There Was a Time. And what happened when I was making a documentary for Discovery, and they wanted me to do a documentary about Watergate and the post-Watergate period, and I felt, you know, we kind of been there. I've made my statement on that with the film that I made, and I don't know that I want to go back there, but they said, well, give it some consideration. So I looked at a lot of archival footage, and I saw something amazing. There was a time when Watergate was going on, and the investigation was going on about Nixon. And I was right in the middle of that as a young man. And you had John Dean as a spokesperson for Nixon's camp. And lined up, questioning him, were people from the left and the right, Republicans and Democrats, all lined up in a line, working together to get to the truth. And of course, I took that for granted at the time, but when I look back on it, with time having passed, and seeing how polarized we'd become as a nation, and how two sides don't listen to each other anymore, they set the stakes in the ground, and they draw a line that you're not supposed to cross. I thought, well, we're not going to go anywhere. But there was a time. So why don't we go back and look at that time and make a film out of it and say, you know, there was a time when two sides worked together to get to the truth. And so I think it's still possible. But I think that's what it's going to take, two sides working together rather than not listening to each other.
I think with this group, another really important distinction is the fact that, and you with legacy and land legacy, again, I'm going to quote you again. I think you said that every time you have a few extra bucks, you like to buy a little bit more property around you. And I just want to remind everybody that we are sitting tonight on property that was at one time owned by some of the people whose descendants are even here in the room, the Ryerson family, the Smiths, the Donnellys, other notable families allowed this piece of land to exist for preservation and for enjoyment. You too are doing this, as we saw in the film, as a legacy of your land for the country to enjoy in perpetuity. What motivated you for the legacy, the land that you have left open?
Well, when I got 2 acres in 1960, it was just to build a cabin. I didn't know at that time, I didn't have a broader view of things. I wasn't aware that I was surrounded by a sensibility with the culture that I was in the middle of, which was not my culture. But I was in the middle of a culture that was about development and expanding development to make more money. And so I missed that. I just assumed that this little piece of land I got in the midst of this incredible land at large was something everybody would adhere to, everybody would want to preserve. So once I became aware that that was not going to happen, that what they really wanted to do was to develop everything around me, I said, well, then the only thing I can do is to try to take a loan, and I will buy as much land as I can around me to keep it protected. And so that's what happened. Then over time, I kept adding more and more land that I would then buy and then put in a conservation easement so it could never be developed. So we ended up with, now we have 5,000 acres that's now protected.
And isn't it sad, in order to pay off the loan, he had to make Butch and Sundance? We're coming to the end.
Yes,
here,
we are.
aren't
We have to thank our environmental lawyer who's here, George Covington, who helped us with our easements.
Well, there
We're
is
living
another
in
motivation.
his house right now, so.
There is another motivation. Yes, I'm a conservationist. I want to stop developers. but it was the tax deduction that got me.
It's the one good tax deduction the government got right, I have to say. But we want to thank both of you and to honor you tonight with this award. It really means a lot. As you saw, the legacy of the people. Robert Torrey Peterson was the first person to get this award as one of the early environmentalists. And as I say, both of you are really leaders in the modern movement. So thank you.